And if you want to give us a brief update on what you've been up to, and then we'll get into the questions.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Shaggy, thanks for having me back here. Lot to discuss since we had that last interview. Some of the forecasts that I put out entering into this grand solar minimum, some of the things that you would look for as this intensifies are actually coming to fruition. I believe 2017 is definitely going to be the year. So as we roll through this last couple of months of 2016 into the winter of 2017, your heads are going to spin on how fast it gets cold and how much snowfall envelops this northern hemisphere. We've seen what happened through the entire southern hemisphere this year. From, let's say, May until now, it has been record snows, record cold, once in a lifetime, once in 100-year storms, like 3 times in a row in Australia. Record cold across Brazil, decimating agriculture, especially their coffee crop got smashed, about 36% loss of the Arabica crop. You know, you just don't hear about a lot of this in the news. In South Africa, record cold, record snow, Zimbabwe snows, are unheard of up there. Just a lot going on in the southern hemisphere. Never talked about really through the mainstream media. And then when we come into August this year, there's been snowstorms, 3 places in the United States. That one main blizzard in Yellowstone National Park drops 8 inches of snow in late August. Yet that's just supposed to be normal in the warmest year ever. Also, those record cold temperatures across Norway that were brought about by that Arctic cyclone. You mentioned to me earlier about the cryosphere data being down. That's so true. I actually did a video on that. That cryosphere, why is that not being updated? But my forecast is this next month is not going to melt down to the lowest point ever. And if it does not melt to the lowest point ever, it is quickly going to increase, probably the fastest you've seen in, well, way past the satellite record, even past the 1930s when the National Geographic did amazing cartography and showed you how much ice was in there. As we enter into the last couple of months of 2016, you're going to see anomalous blizzards and snow events. And then when we come into 2017, early year for the Northern Hemisphere, winters like you have never experienced before. There's going to be something that makes your head just say, why is this possible with this global warming? Oh, I'm sorry, they renamed it climate change because it didn't warm like it was supposed to. None of what they've called with the models, with the reaction of the planet, with the atmosphere, none of that's coming true, so they had to rename it. And if I may, I wanted to throw kind of a wild card into this one here. Everything you're seeing going on globally, with all these regional conflicts sparking nation against nation, race against race, this is all a distraction. They're trying to distract you that the weather's not the way it should have been for their models. Something else is taking place. And also the food price rises, which are going to get in the exponential, which means 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times price is going to usher in an enormous amount of chaos. They're literally going to have to control cities at that point in food delivery stations, if you will. So if there could be problems manipulated early to set up the police state, so when it does really come to that point where it's needed to control the masses that are starving and fighting for food, it's already in place. They don't have to react to it. They can actually set up the circumstances to put themselves in play like you would do on a chessboard. So Shaggy, I'll let you get started here. Anything that's on the board, I will be happy to answer any of those questions. And if we get something that pings on as we go forward, I'll throw that to me as well.
Anyway, some are comments and some are questions. I'm going to start off with Rachel Wordsmith comment. She states, weak sun, strong sun happens, but greenhouse gas still traps heat. David?
I'll take that as a blanket question. Which greenhouse gas would that be referring to? If you know, in our atmosphere, water vapor is the main constituent up there. And as we go down in density, we're looking at methane, nitrous oxide, and then we get down to that little teeny tiny 3/100ths of 1%. Please understand that. That's 0.03% of our atmosphere, not even 1%. You would need 30 of those volumes together to equal just 1%. That's carbon dioxide. I will agree. Carbon dioxide does rise and does fall in concentrations, parts per million, in the atmosphere over the millions of years that this planet has had that type of atmosphere. Now, we do want to talk on longer time scales. This whole thing of the last 100 years or the last 30 years, that in itself, to judge what's happening with the climate over hundreds of thousands of years. But if we look at the long-term temperature data and the long-term CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, you'll find that over hundreds of thousands of years of time scale, CO2 actually trails the temperature. The temperature is the driver to release the CO2 or capture it again. And you know, CO2 does have a great effect on plant growth. That's why routinely in greenhouse growing areas, they pump an enormous amount of CO2 up to about 1,200 parts per million, which is about 3 times more than what's in our atmosphere, to get your nice plump strawberries to grow faster in the wintertime or other times of the year for quicker harvest and also higher yield. But one little tidbit for people who are always asking me for references. Murray Soundby does a great job showing the actual amplification or effect of CO2 in our atmosphere, and it's not even detectable beyond the baseline. It's actually in the background noise. That's how non-effective at changing very much or anything on this planet there is. It's in the background noise. It's not even above that level, which leads us into the thought then, if CO2 is not the driver, then it has to be the water vapor. So what's increasing the cloud cover across the planet is surely not the evaporation from the oceans because it's a warmer climate. That is an excuse they're giving you to try to deflect you from looking at the decreased magnetosphere, the increasing cosmic rays, and if you look at Heinrich Svenssmark's work, you'll see that that cosmic ray acts as cloud nucleation, and then more lower clouds form between 15,000 and 18,500 feet. This will start to explain why all these record floods are occurring globally right now. And if you have noticed the mark of them, they're always at the 100, 200, 500, or 1,000 year marks. And that would go right back in with the 400, 800, or 1,200 year patterns that these grand solar minimums follow.
Yeah, that's pretty open ended on that. I wish Rachel Wordsmith was here to continue that conversation, but is not. So we're going to move on with Minion. He presented a video and adds the Venus Jupiter conjunction might well be what kickstarts the mini ice age. You have any thoughts on that, Dave?
Now, specifically with that conjunction of Venus, I'm not sure, but when we do talk about the Jovian gas giants, those are the ones that seem to have some effect magnetically that kicks everything off for the grand solar minimums. If you look over time, you're going to find the same pattern that's re-emerging starting in 2019, 20, up to 2024, when we get into this exact parallel pattern. If you go back to 1645, you'll find the same types of parallel pattern. When you go back to 79 AD, that is a perfect match with what's coming up in 2024. So before, when I was doing all this research, I was looking into the 400-year patterns. You know, something's matched up in the 1800s. It's really interesting how in the 1840s also you get the first parallel pattern. It doesn't match up so much with the second. After 10 years, as these planets go around in their rotations, it's a 10-year window there, they'll come back in and they'll reform into a different type of pattern again. So if it's 2024, it'll be 2034, and you'll see what I mean. If you use Solar System Scope, that's a good one. It's free software on the internet. You don't even have to download it. Just kind of run inside there. Put the dates inside the orbital diagrams, and you can see what I mean. They have a nice visual of the planets themselves. When we start looking back at different time frames, 1340s has another one, but the one that really matches up exactly is 2024 and 2034, and that matches back up with 79 AD. So when you hear about these 1,000-year rainstorms, 2,000-year rainstorms, it seems like it's coming on this, not the smaller 1.5 drop grand solar minimum. I believe we're going into a full-blown grand solar minimum that's going to drop the temperatures 3 to 4 C globally, probably higher in some areas, up to 5, 6 C. Drop in temperatures, and you'll start to see that this winter emerging. Look for the cold in unexpected places and early blizzards and snowstorms. And I really do want to drive the point home. This is the first year of the full cycle that we're getting into. The bottom of the cooling won't even occur until 2024, 2025 or so. Now, if we're already getting these kind of gargantuan effects with floods on the 500, 1,000-year levels, we're getting snows and record cold that has been broken back to the 1840s continuously now. Almost every record that's being broken has been since records began, and that's all in the middle 1800s, at least for the United States and Canada. Some places go back a little further in Europe. But if we're already getting into this kind of cooling right now on just the very cusp of this, imagine what's going to come up in the next few years that's going to affect our global crop production. And that's the whole reason I started my channel was we need to start to work together quickly to figure out a new food growing strategy, because as temperatures cool and the seasons get shorter and there's rainstorms and heavy snows on the crops that we should be harvesting at certain times of the year, that regularity of the harvest and planting time is going to be quickly out of whack in the next few years. And that goes right back into the exact same thing I was talking about, is why the police state may get put into place in advance, because they know that these food shortages are coming, because these people that are in power, or considered in power, I don't give them my power, but they consider themselves in power. But I don't go along with that. I'm a sentient being. I make my own choice. They have the knowledge as well. They know the longer patterns. That information is hidden from you, but they know the patterns are repeating. That's why they're building seed banks in different parts of the world. That's why the saber rattling is going on. South China Sea, all this area around there, the saber rattling. Now all the governments can get ready. Back in the United States, seems to be the race cards being played, so every city can come out and get everybody ready and get the police and National Guard on their toes. And over in Europe, it's a refugee crisis. Wow, here comes again. Everybody's in and out. Police states getting put into place. And then through the Middle East, unfortunately, that place has been decimated. But everywhere you look on this planet, even down in Africa, Turkey now, everywhere you look, the police state is being slowly unveiled before your eyes. And it would seem as if it's normal. Because there's conflict, there's trouble, there's unrest, there's something this, there's something that. And when you look around and you see troops on the streets or extra police here, you're like, oh, I'm glad they're there to keep me safe. They're getting people kind of pre-programmed to have more movement of these types of figures on the streets that are armed. And when it comes down to it, they're going to be needed greatly to control the food supply. So please put this in your mind. This is the beginning of it. These next 9 years are going to get so intense. So intense. It's going to reshape our world. Civilizations collapse because of these food shortages that are coming. If you look at the Chinese dynasties, every time there's a grand solar minimum, their dynasty, their ruler, their emperor changed because they couldn't feed the people. There were droughts, there were floods, it was cold. Innumerable different types of catastrophes befell them, and they lost their mandate from heaven to rule. Now, you'll see this again in Japan, you'll see it in Korea, you see it in China. Every time these grand solar minimums come, the rulership changes. And it's not going to be any different today. As a global food delivery system, it only takes one little tiny break in that, and then everything else down the tracks goes off. So, if I can impart any one thing to all of you listening tonight, please prepare yourselves. Learn how to grow your own food. Learn how to fix things around your homes better. Learn to do what you have and make do. Know your neighbors. That's one thing. Know your neighbors. Know who you can count on, who you can trust. And do not be going out there with a big flag telling everybody, hey, I'm prepping. Shh. Oh, and by the way, in the United States, if you have more than 7 days worth of food or water, you can be considered a hoarder under this new hoarder law, and they can come and take all of your things. But it's funny because then just a few months ago, Obama says, hey, Americans, get ready. You need 2 weeks worth of food and water in your home. Yet they just passed a law that said if you had more than 7 days worth of food and water, that was against the hoarder laws and they could come in and take everything. So again, you see all these diametric opposing messages. So anyway, going to need to prepare. This is going to be a society-changing event for sure.
Yeah, I have to agree. I might comment a little more on Jovian planets as we continue on a little later. But for now, we're going to go with the questions. This one comes from Toxic 32. Given that over the last 5 million years, the climate is shown to be on a steady downward curve, as shown in the graph. He goes on and touches into some other items like CO2, underwater volcanic activity, etc. And then his question is, do you have any idea what caused the last ice ages in the past? David?
There's a lot of conjecture on this point, but we don't have enough human observation because those cycles run in hundreds of thousands of years. I mean, even going out at the furthest, even if we talk about prior civilizations that had higher advanced technology, the furthest back, even through legend, that could be traced back would be 70,000 years, mainly from the European side. But if we go into the Indian Vedas, we can go back about 230,000 years or so. But still, that would only be 2 cycles to study it. Whether the Jovians have a kick-in effect for a full glaciation event, not sure. But the cycle looks like a sine wave, an electrical wave, when we do look at the Jovians inducing a grand solar minimum. This also has to do with the electric universe. You'll have to take a look into the way electricity flows through plasma in the interstellar medium. The electric universe is a fascinating concept to consider in itself on why the sun would decrease or increase its activity state, because as we're all told, it's an internally fired, internally combusted star. Now, if that were the case, it should remain at an even ambient balance, not changing at all, except for another, billion years into the future or something. With these ebbs and flows that are coming every 400 years, every 100,000 years on the glaciation cycle, make no sense for an internally powered star. It has to be external Birkeland currents on a wave pattern charging or discharging the star. That's the only possible explanation. And just to put that into perspective, okay, the last, say, 40 years, we had really good satellite data that gave us more precise measurements of our Earth. Prior to that, we were using thermometers dragging behind ships as we opened the first trading routes across the oceans. You think about thermometers and telescopes, those things are only hundreds of years old. They're not thousands of years old. Stellar observations are. But when we talk about instrumentation to measure the temperatures, just think about that. Even if we get at the furthest reach back and even say 500 years just to be round, 100,000 years? Literally, when we cut that down and you do the division on it, we're talking minuscule amounts of time observation there. So when people talk about, oh, everything's changing, we can see it from the satellite record. 40 years in time, let's divide that again by 100,000 years. And it gets into the ridiculous, down into a thousandth of a percent of observational time on this planet. So I believe that there is an ebb and a flow in the electrical current through space that causes these longer term declines. And yes, it is declining. So will this next minimum be a little deeper than the last one? Because you do see it's on a decline, and he is correct with that, Shaggy.
I have to agree with a lot of that. I really believe there's more of a connection through the Jovian planets than some might know, only due to the fact that they're much larger. And I've been researching some of this, and the magnetic field of Jupiter alone is spectacular, and everything is interconnected. And they're finding a pulsing of, so to say, of Jupiter's magnetosphere that correlates with our solar minimum. and maximum. So that's a pretty interesting point in itself. Moving on, Undweeb. Is there a relationship between solar bombardment fluctuations, rise and fall of the protonic matter, and the strength or weakness of Earth's core magnetic field? And does this secondarily and similarly affect the rise and fall of Earth's core temperature, which seem to directly correlate to the surface temperature and therefore a wide variation of weather?
Talking about galactic cosmic rays. Now, the specific instance of protons penetrating the Earth's crust down into the core, affecting the heating coming back up and the crustal displacement and the core temperature, I don't have an answer for that. But what I can directly connect and correlate is that when the solar wind pressure decreases with the amount of positively charged particles, these protons that are Earth's negatively charged, when that displacement occurs between the atmosphere, you would definitely see an increase in volcanic activity, atmospheric compression events, or, so I would say, vortices in the atmosphere, heavier rain events. Get into this whole feedback loop. When the volcanism increases, you have the sulfur dioxide and the particulates in the atmosphere acting as cloud nuclei, but they also have the galactic cosmic rays themselves acting as precursors for cloud nuclei. And then you get into the whole feedback loop. When there's so much cloud cover, the albedo effect takes over. Once the solar wind increases in pressure again, it settles everything back down. We get into this drier phase while the clouds disappear. Shaggy.
Thank you. Now, another comment here is from Poot, who states, I actually spent a lot of time a few years ago researching a sudden influx of massive earthquakes and their correlation to planetary alignments. And I found there was little to no change based upon said alignments. I'm assuming she was referring to, I believe, what Minion had presented up in the video.
That depends where the coronal holes would be in the sun as well during these alignments. So if the coronal holes, say, facing 90 degrees west, and the alignment's happening, say, 270 degrees from north to south, if you will, they're not going to connect and get that electrical connection. But if the solar coronal hole streams are in line with those planetary alignments, that's when you get those earthquakes. A couple apps out there now. There's been a lot of new research. Kompap Uyen and Ben Davidson, they've done this as well, published papers, peer-reviewed, talking about the specific coronal hole stream affecting earthquakes on the planet, specifically with planetary geometry and planetary alignments. But the coronal hole needs to be in play. If you don't have the coronal hole stream, you're not going to get those larger quakes in the planetary alignments. Shaggy.
Yeah, thank you. The only thing I can really add to that is just kind of some baseline data that shows that 80.6% of the largest and extreme volcanic activity, I believe, is during solar minimums and maximums. As far as the relationship to planetary alignment, I can't associate that with. I can only add that as far as basic data that I know of. Which basically leads into my statement or question that I posted, stating that exact fact of 80.6 of the largest volcanic activity has happened in those time events. I was questioning if a major volcanic activity increases or a large eruption happens during a mini ice age, could that not help push it into a larger ice age status? Or would it take more of a larger event to push it into a major ice age?
Back to the planets again. Yes, so every time you see large planets aligning, it doesn't mean that we're going to have a large earthquake on this planet. It takes a special set of circumstances. 11-year regular cyclical maximums and minimums, you will find that that does match up really well, Shaggy. You're correct. And I'll bring the point back up again. The time frames that we've been dealing with science, that's only 400 or 500 years old. We need to look back into legend when we want to find out about when the megaquakes occurred, the reasons for the heavens shaking. These are real events that people witness, but they just tried to describe it in a different way because if you saw something on that magnitude, even with your own knowledge today, could you truly explain it to somebody? And back at that time, how would you record that event in the heavens? With the knowledge that either paper will be erased after a few hundred years, or even if you carved it in stone, those stones might be buried, broken, or reused for different, I don't know, building purposes. How would you save this knowledge of changes in the heavens over longer time frames other than putting it into a verbal passed down legend? And that's kind of where you need to look to see if some of these things are induced by what, and if there's any correlation inside the traditional stories of either precursors or the actual events themselves and the event time frames themselves. Because now with the different types of core data, whether it be sediment lake core drilling or even sediment cores from the oceans themselves, we got the ice cores, of course, everybody knows about that. How about the stalactites? Did you know those stalactites that hang off the roof of caves? If you cut those, they're very much like tree rings. So you can measure down how much rainfall was in an area. Those are tens of thousands of years, some of those stalactites. Tree ring data doesn't go back that far. We need to go really far back into the legends. And that's what I am so much about, is these cyclical patterns are preserved in the legends of our oral history across all traditions planet-wide. We could talk about the precession of the equinoxes going around for the 25,950 years, for the mathematics involved in that, but it's preserved in every single tradition and every society. So when we need to go back further than 30,000 or 70,000 years, you really need to get back into some of these older texts. And instead of taking it just a bunch of mumbo jumbo people that didn't know what they were talking about, why don't we do it the inverse? Like they knew specifically what they were talking about, and they were specifically trying to relate the story to us. And that was a true and factual event. Now let's investigate it like we would an actual scientific theory that's put out and presented to you. And how are you going to tell your ancestors? How are you going to warn them that this event occurred? These are the precursors, and look out because it just absolutely changed everything. You will survive through it if you work together and then come out the other side. How are you going to present that to everybody? Cultures that, were fearful of lightning. They were fearful of plasma discharge from a planetary body down to another planetary body. They were not fearful of lightning. They were fearful of planetary discharge. I could see why the legends were as such. These differentials are between the positive and negative charge. Have you noticed recently the uptick in electrical storms? As this differential continues to widen, the electrical ferocity of these storms is going to continue to increase as well over the next 10 years. So all these lightning deaths across the planet, you are literally at the cusp again. You've seen nothing yet. So what does trigger one of these epic ice ages? And will the mini ice age kick off a larger ice age? David LaPointe says that coming around 2030, the primer field of the sun is going to decrease down to almost a zero state, and that will trigger the next maximum ice age. But the maximum glaciation, will that happen? I don't know, but I will say for sure that the people running around this planet 500 years ago, invading cultures, pillaging, trying to take their queen and king into another place in South America or Asia or whatever it was, took home a lot of relics, and those relics that we are not allowed to see, that are buried in some vault or at the bottom in some library that's hidden from public view, that contains the true knowledge. And I do believe that the ancients had knowledge of cycles on the 25,000 year cycle going back millions of years. And I do believe they had that, and I do believe that that information was found. And all the archaeological discoveries that you've heard about, they always seem to be quickly covered up if there has anything to do with ancient cycles in there. So, Shaggy, I went maybe off on a little tangent there. I don't know about the larger cycle coming up. Smaller ones do for sure right now.
Oh, please, tangent away. There's no restrictions on what's happening here, and willing to listen to thoughts of yours on anything, even if it's veering off course a bit. But one thing I would like to add, as far as these electrical storms and such, I found a paper from NASA themselves dated March 19th, 2003, that speaks of lightning and how it actually increases the nitrogen oxides, which lead to formation of ozone. It actually, during summer months, lightning activity increases nitrous oxide as much as 90% and ozone by more than 30%. So there are a lot of natural causes here that actually they point out and use and manipulate or not share to their advantage on what they're trying to, their end game is, whatever that may be. But we'll get to the next question here. Oth states the question I wanted to ask: a heating and cooling cycle is dependent on axis or a-axis tilt. Guy, I'm not sure who he's speaking about there, and the community around him are claiming a 1 degree this year and are saying there may be as much as a 20 plus degree by September 17th, focusing on March in 2016 and 2017.
And degree of the tilt, I will agree with that. Now, will it continue to tilt further? Because the magnetic pole's on the move. It's moving around 80 miles per year toward Kamchatka and Russia. So not only is the magnetosphere decreasing, the solar wind's decreasing, but our magnetic poles are actually moving. Magnetic, not geophysical poles, but the magnetic poles. So when you start to see all these very unusual animal migrations, they seem to be in the wrong place at the wrong time of the year. And as we're starting to see massive thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of things beaching themselves, whether it be squids or starfish, the larger ones that we care about, basically the whales, all depend on this echolocation, and they use magnetics to move around along with the bird migration. So imagine that. Let's do the simple math. If it's moving at 80 miles a year, and it's been going at that clip for the last 5 years, that's 400 miles in a difference for an animal that's going to migrate using magnetic field lines. So you can see how something would end up literally 500 miles out of its range or 1,000 miles out of its range. Makes sense. The 1 degree, that's a full long year. What's the end that they're predicting for March 2017 on a 20-degree roll on that? I didn't understand that part of it.
Okay, well, thank you, and we'll move on to RK Oblin. My question is with regards to HR 2977, written by Dennis J. Kuknick in 2002, and the current verbiage regarding weather manipulation / modification.
Yeah, that opens up a whole can of worms, doesn't it? Now they're talking about using plasma bombs in space instead of the HARP facilities. And then interestingly, one of my subscribers wrote to me and said, are they trying to break through the stargates by using this particular new technology? And that really intrigued me as well, because I believe our history goes much, 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 much further back than they're putting out for the average person. The Younger Dryas period, 11,500 years ago, there was a rapid decline in temperatures, rapid warming in temperatures, but that's never talked about. Temperature spikes up 20 C. Nobody ever talks about that Younger Dryas period. But when we came out of that, that's where the reemergence of all the societies came from. Now, it's really interesting how they were speckled around the planet, and they all had the same legends, they all had the same stone carvings, the same techniques, the same symbology, and we come back. How did they have that? If they were supposedly disconnected and there was no intercontinental travel until the last 500 years in a linear time frame, how is there so much similarity globally, continentally, from tens of thousands of years ago, 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago? There has to be another story behind it. This is what I wanted to bring that to, is part of these stories go into, Earthspin has the Van Allen radiation belt and some other belts around it that are impenetrable, if you will, trying to break through these belts for a while, and they call it the Stargate, to try to break through to allow access off planet, which has so far been a little difficult to travel interstellar or intersolar system. I can see where he's going with the question here. New technology supposed to help humankind. In the front, when they give you out that initial story layer of the onion, it's always for weather modification, and that's always what's talked about so much. What about the back? What's the second layer of the onion? So that's where we need to try to go back into ancient history and connect this high tech. And do they really have that much control over a large global system of weather? I'm not convinced yet. Locally, yeah, I could believe that they could bend the ionosphere locally to create some local effects on the weather, but as a global manipulated system where they can move every square inch of air and cloud cover around this planet to come out with an outcome that they desire, to either drop more rainfall for allies or put a drought in some enemy's territory. I don't know if they really have that much full control over the atmosphere yet.
And that's pretty much it for the questions that were on the thread. I just like right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some simple knowledge that all this CO2 increase and stuff is natural. I've looked into it. As you stated earlier, a lot of it does come from water and the water vapor. It's a natural process. Like it comes from the erosion, of land itself and washes into the water and recycles. Underwater volcanic activity, it all correlates, and it seems to be like a heartbeat. Some use to describe it as far as the changes on Earth. And I'd like to go into maybe some AMO and PDO readings as of late, and also affect not only North America but the Northern Hemisphere in its changes. So
Talk about the Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation, the AMO. This is a driver of the temperature in the Northern Hemisphere. Now go to a website called Wood for Trees, WOODFORTREES. Wood for Trees. This site, you can make your own graphs and charts. It's fully interactive. Atlantic surface temperatures, the tropospheric temperatures, the ground-based temperatures from all the temperature stations. They have the Pacific decadal oscillation temperatures. They have the Indian dipole. And you can overlap everything. So if you go in there, and if you put in the AMO temperatures, say go back to 1870, and then if you overlay the land-based surface temperatures, which are basically the ground-based stations where they have the thermometers, if you overlay that, you get almost a perfect match. What happens is the AMO is really the driver of the Northern Hemisphere temperatures, and it's on a decline, and I mean a steep decline quickly. The water at 600 meters deep, years ago, there was a giant separation. There was very little warm water that deep. And what has happened over the last 3 years, that cold water has made it all the way to the surface. That is a huge, 600 meters, we're talking about 1,000 feet of water circulation of that cold water coming right to the surface now. Europe's going to have a difficult time growing crops. There's going to be a lot more rainfall, cooler temperatures, and if that thing does switch over as it does when it's on a 60-year cycle, so you can go back in time 60 years and see the last time when the peak and it dropped off going into the trough. Back in the 1940s as well, you can see different. You go back in early 1900s, go back to the 1880s specifically. So when you start to see all these temperatures being broken, that matches up with the last cycle of the cold and the AMO seesawing on its 60-year pattern. I encourage you to go into Wood for Trees, get those charts, overlay the temperatures, really take a look at the data there. It's so easy to use. You just put the parameter of when you want to start and when you want to finish, all the way back to 1870 and then start to 2015. Start overlaying everything and it comes up as a different color, quite easy to use. It's kind of intuitive as well. You can just plug and play on that. Let's talk about the Pacific for a moment. This came off the largest El Nino to record so far, and this even comes from the whaling days back in the 1800s when they used to drag thermometers behind ships. So this was the warmest that the equatorial Pacific registered in the last 150 years. But what's interesting is every time There's a gigantic rise in temperature. It's followed by a gigantic steep decline in temperature. And guess what happened this week? They decided to revise the temperatures upward for the La Nina. So before they said it was going to be minus 2.2 C, bottom temperatures, and now they revised it and said it's only going to be 1.5 C. Not going to be as cold as predicted. So here we go. This word cold is almost a new four-letter word. It's a dangerous word to be using. Now the La Nina, which is predicted to be cold, now they're saying it's not going to be cold because it doesn't fit the narrative. So there's some manipulation going on the future forecast for La Nina, and it's starting right now. So pattern overlaps. The Pacific's going to cool for the next, say, 8 months. Atlantic's on a cooling trend. The sunspots are dropping off 3 years early. The dipole's going cold. Arctic is regaining some ice, and then also the Antarctic's going into its all-time cold phase down there, gaining ice, except for the underwater volcanic ice shelf areas. So we almost have 5 indicators touching on cold this year. People are coming out already saying, oh, it's not going to be that cold. See, the winter didn't even start yet, but the media has brainwashed people so much that they're saying, oh, the winter's not going to be cold because they said La Nina's not going to be cold. And I just don't get it. The winter hasn't even started yet people are already discounting that it's going to be colder than normal or snowier than normal. And in my book, you need to actually be putting food and water away to prepare for these kind of events if you're living in a snow-prone area. You're living up around Buffalo, you better get your ass prepared this year because it's going to be snowier than normal. You live up around Boston, Northeast United States, you better get ready. You're around in the central states, it's going to snow more than normal there. Manipulated and changed data. And how do you disappear a whole degree C off of that in a matter of a month or so? It's just, there's so much manipulation in the media right now.
I have to agree. The research I've done as of late shows it's going to get colder. And even some are saying California is going to be colder than usual till 2030. So I don't understand the hooliganism of the manipulation. I'm not sure why one would not others prepared. I'm not sure why other governments are telling a lot of people to start storing food for a major event. I myself live in Wisconsin. I can tell you I've stocked up on some wood. Of course, I cook, but I got a quart of wood. I started canning some items, and I have some water. It's not out of paranoia, it's more out of preparation and awareness. I really wish some people really research into this. As you state, the media gets on and says some wording, and people follow it without doing their own research and looking into it and finding the manipulation of the facts themselves.
And it's really interesting timing. Several governments have come out now and telling their citizens to prepare. Norway, Germany, Czech Republic, Russia, and the United States now. All these major governments to come out, and specifically Germany. I was shocked when I heard that. Germany coming out to tell their citizens to prepare. I firmly am of the opinion that this is the order of the chaos that's going to ensue because this global cooling, when it comes, is going to affect food prices so drastically that it's going to throw our societies into chaos. Like anything, if there's a typhoon coming or hurricane, you're going to prepare for it. You're going to try to board up your house, and you might, if you're stuck there and you can't get off an island or something, you're really going to try to hunker down and prepare as much as you can. Well, I firmly believe that the powers that be in this planet, they know that this is a cycle and it's here, and there's nothing they can do about it to try to stop it. So they're intently preparing for it. Now, telling citizens to get ready for food and water, I think that might be for the economic collapse that's about to occur. And in lockstep, the way it should pan out like this. First, they're going to have to usher in an economic collapse globally because they're going to try to stop people from fear immigrating. Like you, Shaggy, if you realize that up in Wisconsin it's going to be almost uninhabitable and the weather growing seasons for farmers are going to be so out of whack that they won't be able to grow food after a couple more years, people are going to abandon those areas and they're going to start moving further south. Well, further south doesn't mean in your own country, and like you might move down to Texas or to Alabama or Florida. But what if you decide you want to go to a tropical country like Indonesia or something? Well, they've already staked out claims down there, and the world is a full place. Cause more chaos by having so much mass migration. You got 7 billion people. Imagine if even 1 billion of ththose wanted to up and relocate. 2 billion people, that would be absolute chaos. There'd be so much stretched resources. It would be chaotic at best trying to hold that together. So the best, I don't know, course of action, I've been told firsthand, this is the best course of action. Collapse the economy and prevent people from moving. When I say collapse, I don't mean a little downturn like we saw in the 1980s or 2009. I'm talking about a complete wipeout where you got no money to move around. When it comes up to that point, then they can usher in quickly any types of police forces and army. And when that's in play, then when the food shortages come, there's already body in place to control the chaos from the food shortages. Now, all this from start to finish is less than 3 years, 2019-20. And this goes in with the food security game. You know what's going to happen. So look for the chess pieces to move like this in order. 1, economic collapse coming. 2, by 2017, you're going to see cold weather, flash freeze events. I'm talking Mastodon's frozen kind of flash freeze events. It's going to come so fast and so furious. It's going to shock people in this modern age that they didn't call it correctly, that they have these atmospheric compression events where there was already a foot of rain in a matter of 3 hours. That 1 inch of rain is going to turn into a foot of snow. So you can imagine the massive snowstorms coming through that would drop 12 feet of snow in a few hours on a place. That's going to collapse power grids. There's a whole tidal wave of things that are about to unfold on this with this new solar minimum coming in here. Food growing is not going to be as stable, so they're going to have to try to take control of the populace before the populace gets out of control. It's going to be a preemptive measure, and they firmly and they absolutely believe this. They believe from the bottom of their hearts by letting all of this chaos unfurl that they're going to save more lives than let everybody move freely. There's going to be a greater savings of life by this control mechanism with the police state. The think tank studies done show that if individuals are allowed to roam free and immigrate freely as this crisis unfurls across this planet and move where they want and when they want and take their resources with them wherever they go, it's going to create 90% losses of the global population. But they really feel, they truly believe it, that if they control it and they usher in this global police state, that they can minimize the loss to 30% loss of global population. That's their minimum amount in the think tanks. 30% is the minimum, 90% is the maximum. You know, after I was listening to this, I was a bit unnerved for weeks. It took me a couple weeks to really recover from all that information overload that I got. Look for blizzards. If I'm on the correct track and if the information I've been giving is correct, blizzards at the end of the month here in unexpected places. And when I say blizzards, I don't mean dustings of snow. I'm talking feet of snow months ahead, months in advance of the normal. And snowfalls this year are going to be record-breaking 2 to 3, 400-year snowfalls. It really looks like we're getting ready to repeat something from 79 AD. It looks like we're getting ready to repeat a 2,000-year pattern here, which is interesting when you go back into all the, again, the legendary types of philosophies. But food growing, going to be losses of crop areas. 45 North that grows wheat. Specifically the winter of 2018 and 19. This is going to be the rollover point where wheat growing areas will be offline. And that's one of the major concerns they had also was, what are the substitution crops going to be? If you cannot get the amount of wheat that we need currently for breads and processed foods, switch crops, and will it be buckwheat, or will it be millet, or will it be sorghum, or will it be amaranth? First things are going to be, they're going to try to switch to rice right away. But, you know, Americans don't eat rice. You know, Asians eat rice, and when the rice prices, we're trying to grab their rice, everything's going to get all out of whack on the commodities trading just for the basic food commodities. The periphery crops like amaranth, there's going to be a whole need for distribution for amaranth. Machinery to process it and plant it. Sorghum is going to be another huge crop that's going to be pushing the corn that we're using for ethanol right now. They're going to take away that mandate in about 2 years. The animals aren't going to be able to eat as much. There's going to be a drastic decline in meat production. A whole plethora of things that are discussed, and the crops are the main thing. And the panic of the initial food buying. But then that'll be offset by the panic when people realize that this is a long-term, multi-year, multi-decade event. And that's where the psyche of a lot of people is going to break. When your food price costs double next year and triple next year, and then in 2019 it costs you 10 times more, and you're spending most of your wages that you're earning to buy food, that's not going to sit well with people, and the changes are going to come. So they're trying to put everything in place. Food price rises come and the riots come, that they already have a whole mechanism in place to try to control it. You know, it may sound dark to us that they're going to allow 30% loss in the population by not warning people in advance. They're going to create a larger chaos by warning people in advance. Losses, hey, it's going to happen. What made me really kind of go, whoa, really? They're really trying to prevent the 90%, 80% loss. 2 billion loss, and they're trying to accept that versus a 7 billion loss. It took me weeks to wrap my head around this. It truly did, and I'm trying to portray the information the way I got it.
That's amazing. If you think about it and take it all in, it can be overwhelming and hard to believe at times, but I encourage others to go research for themselves. What I'd like to do here now, Adapt, if you don't mind, is perhaps some people can post some questions in the chat wall here, and maybe you can grab a couple of those if so willing.
Still willing. Evil Weeb, I saw you last time on the post. Hey, I answered your question as well. Welcome back. Don't look at this as a negative time. Look at this as a time of enlightenment for everybody, because the technology jumps that are going to occur right now in terms of food growing production, the amount of investment that's going to be needed to put all this in play, it's going to revitalize the economies. People are going to learn more. There's going to be more technological revolution now. This is going to be the fourth revolution of technology. I think after this loss of people around the planet too, we're going to come together as a species again. I really think that this time is going to try to reunite the human race, not this distraction that's all around us, but bring us back to the core values of, being what it is to share and help other people. And I really believe we're entering a golden age here after this.
Yeah, I'd like you to touch on. Do you have any thoughts, as Real Gator had brought up? What about these plasma bombs you spoke of recently in your videos? I caught that also.
I find that one of my most fascinating articles that I've ever read, and also one of the videos that I did. And I look at it just from a purely scientific standpoint of, I've had a cold glass in the refrigerator or the freezer, and then I brought it out and put it under hot water by accident, and it cracked. Okay, so when we're way up there in the thermosphere, temperatures are minus 100, minus 200, depending on the height you're at. I want to detonate plasma that's going off at 79,000 Fahrenheit. How do you take something that's below zero and instantly detonate something that's 79,000 degrees? What kind of turbulence will that cause? What kind of shock waves will that cause? That comes back into the whole thing. Are they trying to break a hole through that? Are they trying to create matter from energy versus creating energy from matter? Why are they up there? Why do we have no say in that? That is such a detrimental thing. And when they start doing it, it's not going to be one or two. They want to talk about every time they bounce a radio signal to detonate one of those things. You got to think about military radio traffic. How often does that occur per day? Thousands, if not millions of times. So, A, what's the launch capability? How are they going to put a million of those little tiny satellites up there? And how often are they going to be blowing those off to get better radio reception? I mean, if they're doing it constantly, time after time after time, that's going to create a hot spot up there. How fast does it take to cool down something that's 80,000 degrees? Then what if you detonate another one instantly after that and it doesn't have a chance to cool? And then it's a repeat cycle like this, and they detonate and detonate again and again and again for the radio reception boost. The effects are going to, they don't know what's going to go on up there. That's a sandbox that's never been explored before. Unless you go back into the ancient legends and trying to find a way out to break through these rings up there. So is it ancient legend mixed with technology, or is it straight up technology with no ancient legend mixed in? That's why it was so fascinating for me, delving back to the ancient history and the stories, the ancient Atlantean priest wars, and trying to break through the Stargate to escape this planet.
That's a great reply. I urge everyone that just is here to throw out some questions into the chat wall. I'm going to give Adapt a moment to read through them. I urge you to post some questions while he's sharing his time with us, and anything that you've had in the back of your mind, perhaps he can touch on that.
Yeah, Shaggy, I'll take Will 3214. Talking about the Corn Belt in the United States and a lot of losses due to cold or drought. There are going to be losses, but the wheat is going to be first. Corn likes a little bit cooler, damper, wetter conditions. Especially when it rains more, wheat, mold and blight and wheat are cousins when there's rain. You know, all that stuff that happened in France and down in Louisiana, those heavy rains, things actually started sprouting on the heads of the plants that were growing. There was so much rain that the seed inside the head started to sprout. Wheat's the same way. It likes dry, it likes cold. So look for the wheat losses first. Corn will follow probably around 2019. The corn losses will come, and that's when they're going to try to do the substitute for sorghum because sorghum does a little bit better. They're going to start pushing growing zones approximately 300 kilometers south. About 180 miles was the first zone shift south of where everything grows now. Corn can be pushed south. Sorghum can be pushed south. Wheat cannot be pushed south. That's the problem. When the wheat goes offline, there's nowhere to like push it further south to. Wheat is a Canadian crop. It likes cool. It's northern North Dakota, South Dakota, that whole Central Plains state. That's wheat growing area. You can't move that. Corn's a more movable animal, if you will. What's that? Rocco Bilan. Yes, the solar system does travel like a sine wave up and down the Milky Way. And actually, we turn sideways. We're not vertical. We are horizontal as we travel. And that's where you get into above the ecliptic and below. Perhaps, Shaggy, that could be one of your reasons that it ushers in a full-blown ice age, either above or below the ecliptic.
I'll just add to that point. We are above the ecliptic, and it's pretty much at the same point as where extinction event happened as far as the dinosaurs. I'm not saying there's a correlation, but we are above the ecliptic at this point, about the same point as we were at that time.
Cycles keep repeating. So when I talk about histories, cycles of time, and going back, I actually dig into that because I see the repeating patterns that they had marked in stone for us to remember. And it's not about just looking at the modern scientific data. It's also about delving into the ancient past. These cycles are on 100,000 year scales. They're on million year scales. Technologically advanced societies at that time in the past, 70,000 years, 35,000 years ago, whatever, they would have knowledge of these earlier cycles occurring. What about the people who living 12,000 years ago would have marked something on a cave? Again, that's a marker for their time. What was the cycle occurring at that time? So that's how I try to do a lot of my forecasting as well. Not only taking this 60-year multi-decadal oscillation cycle or the Indian dipole, which is 3 years, or the PDO, the La Nina thing. Why don't we go back in cycles further, the mini ice ages, and then we'll go back even further, and it just keeps coming in and out. And I like to look at the further cycles, 25,000 years. That's another cycle, and above below the ecliptic as well. And you get into these cycles, and they just repeat themselves. So if you can tag on to where the cycle began and where we are in the cycle, you can kind of figure out what the repeat is going to be. That's why I'm so into the ancient history as well as the modern scientific stuff.
Well, everything has to be taken in. You can't just say focused on one item. Everything's connected in ways. You can peruse the board again and see if you like any other questions. I don't want to take too much of your time up. I know it's getting pretty late where you're at, but then again, I don't want to let you go either. So if you're more than willing to answer a few more questions and hang out, that's up to you. You just let us know, and we'll continue on if so.
Talking about the UV, have you noticed the UV spikes? When I was a kid, they used to be high at 10. So there's definitely change in the UV output, there's something that seems to happen during the grand solar minimum. It spikes in the UV and then it just drops off a cliff. And that's the natural protection against mold and blight on the crops. And what they found, though, is the galactic cosmic rays with the increased cloud cover, specifically in the Maunder minimum, they had an enormous amount of mold on the crops. That UV is a natural mold killer and a blight killer. Without that UV, and it has something to do with the diminished output of the sun, that's where a lot of crop losses come in. How much herbicide can we really manufacture at that time to try to protect all these plants? I don't know. If you're in the herbicide business, it's going to be a good time because they're going to need like exponential amounts above what we're using now. Last time, apparently, they call it a biting of the skin, and that's the only way that could be talked about in the 1640s and 1650s. The sun used to bite the skin. Now, I've been outside a lot, and I feel that same. I know exactly what they're talking about, the biting of the skin. The biting of the skin occurs, and then it gets to really heavy intensity biting, and then it just stops, and they go back to almost nothing where it feels like there's no sun. We're kind of right near that rollover point. Now, I can't tell you when it'll occur or when it won't occur, but that's just going back to 1640s, and that's direct writings from people back at the time. Like they would go out in the sun for 20 minutes, and it felt like their skin got itched off, and it would bite, and that's what they used to talk about. So we're kind of repeating that right now, and you can see that's another repeating cycle as well.
Well, thank you. If there's anything else, you just let us know when you're done. We'll do a short wrap up.
Well, thanks, Shaggy. Let's do a quick wrap up here. There's been a lot of work by Theodore Landscheid and also taken on the baton Jeff Scott. These cycles are predictable and repeatable. We can measure the sun with great accuracy now. And by all accounts, across all instrumentation, the output is decreasing. The amount of sunspots is shrinking. It's actually 3 years ahead of schedule. These sun-spotless days that are going on for multi-day periods of time are years ahead of schedule. I don't know why we're debating still this, is it warming? None of the models have worked out so far, so why don't we start looking for a different solution to the reason that our weather's changing so much? Are we so set in a religion now, or is it actually science? Science is supposed to be debated until the very end. That is the point of science. It is never finished. It is never agreed upon because there's always something in the next generation of technologies that proves the last generation completely wrong. Particle physics is a great example. Anywhere you look now with satellites are just umpteen thousand examples of what we used to know to be fact. Oh yeah, the discovery of our outer planets too. So I'm saying that this is an agenda. Forget about the global taxes for the CO2 consumption. That's a distraction. The real play is they know the changes are coming and they're going to try to distract you to the very end so you don't prepare yourself. And only the ones that are really taking to heart the message are going to be the ones that prepare. And that's what they're counting on, is kind of the mind frame of the survival of the fittest. Those who prepare and can kind of find their way through the fog of disinformation, you're the ones that are supposed to survive. They're counting on that. So Shaggy, I will ask everybody, please do your own research on this. We have an internet now. You have something called Google. You have a library. You have library resources on the internet within universities that you could never access before. There's billions of scanned documents, billions of scanned books, and you have an entire internet to look through. You stop watching TV. Stop watching the television. Every time you think to turn on that program, go do some research on this type of stuff. Don't watch TV. That is a programming, mind-numbing distraction device that is going to keep you in the same loop of distraction until your very end. You're going to be in the lines waiting for government assistance, if it even comes, or you're going to be out there on the streets in the food riots because you didn't prepare in time. Either way, Stage is set. We've come to this time every several hundred years. You can see it throughout history how civilizations collapse and they arise. There's golden ages, there's dark ages. What do you think spurs all that on? And most of all, please remember there's a tremendous opportunity right now. It's a time to thrive during this time. We're going to need to do everything from scratch again for our food growing techniques, technology, investment. It's going to be a golden era, truly, for just so many aspects, spiritual, physical, because your body's going to not eat so many processed foods. Just mentally, we're going to come back together again, and you are going to uplift your spirit during this time. It's a great time to be alive. Truly, it is. And with that, Shaggy, thank you so much for the time and opportunity to chat tonight.
You're very welcome, and I encourage you to check out Adapt 2030's YouTube channel. Thank you again, Adapt 2030. We'll see what this winter brings us, and maybe we can get together in the spring and go over what happened. Thanks, everyone, here, and